Welcome to the Paradigm Shift, Conquering Fear. I'm your host, Mia Saenz, and with me this segment is Donna Corso. Welcome, Donna.
Thank you, Mia. Good to be here.
Good to have you. And we're going to be talking about death and dying in this segment of Conquering Fear. And Donna has this book that I started to read because it arrived recently, When the Wind Chimes Chime. And she's going to talk a little bit about the story and how we get from fear and our emotional things that we face and get to the other side. So Donna, would you tell first your story on how you got to where you are writing this book, and then we'll go into the story of the little boy.
Okay, thank you. My story, I guess, goes all the way back to my childhood. I always believed that death would be the most exciting part of life. I don't know why I thought that, but my parents just did funerals and wakes, and it was a sad time for everyone, but I always thought, gee, I wonder why we're really sad, because I always thought it was the most exciting part, because I believed we got to go on to something even better. So I always had that mindset. In my 20s and 30s, I really got involved in reading some of Ruth Montgomery's books. Are you familiar with Ruth Montgomery?
No.
She was one of the very first metaphysical authors, a best-selling author. She's passed away now, but she wrote many, many books. She was a very credible journalist in Washington, worked in the White House in many administrations, but then later began to write metaphysical books. And all of her books, which were channeled, they all ended with predictions about these times that we're in right now, and that there might be a lot of death and dying, perhaps earth changes, things like that. I remember writing her to tell her how much I enjoyed her books, and she wrote, and I told her I wasn't afraid of these coming times, that I thought it would be an exciting time to be on the planet. She wrote me back a little handwritten note, I wish I still had it, in a little envelope, and in essence she said, yes, I believe you'll be one of the people that will be on the planet in those times, these times, and you will be helping people to die without fear. So that's a phrase that I have held in my heart all these years. I volunteered a little bit for hospice when I lived in Ohio, and again in Colorado. And I did a little bit of volunteer work in the hospital, just with energy work with people who were either dying or maybe people who had AIDS or cancer. I don't know, I just wanted to surround myself with that energy and to help people to know that it's safe, that they are safe, and that they can pass very peacefully. So that's where I just always had a feeling there was something I was going to do beyond that. And when I heard the story of this little boy, I heard it from his father, and I thought, oh, I'm supposed to write that story. And so I did.
Wow. All right, let's talk about the little boy's story. When I first started reading it, until you told me in our little pre-interview, I thought maybe he was related to you. So that's beautiful that you took up someone else's story to write. So share with us about him.
I guess I never met him. His name was Andreas. He was 7 years old when he died. I know his parents. I met them just about 3 or 4 years ago. I heard his father stand up in a meeting and tell briefly about his son who had died, and that's when I knew I was supposed to write the story. Because it's a sad story. I wanted to open hearts, but I also wanted to open eyes. Because when Andreas was 7, he was diagnosed with osteosarcoma, which is bone cancer. It was in his upper arm. They took him to the doctors, of course, and the doctors did all kinds of x-rays and MRIs and test after test after test. Then they would send him to another doctor, and they would repeat the same tests over and over. And eventually it got to the point where it was pretty clear that he was not going to be returning to health. However, the doctors said that they wanted to amputate his arm, part of his lungs, part of his ribs, give him chemo, and give him radiation. All of this, even though it had already spread into other bone tissue, already had spread into his blood system. It had metastasized. The parents, Gordy, his father, the little boy's name is Andreas. Gordy, his father, had done much research online and discovered about 300 other children who had had similar diagnoses, and their parents went along with that kind of a protocol. And every single one of them, 100% of them, died anyway, and they died a horrible death. So Gordy and his wife Joey didn't want that for Andreas. If they were going to lose him, they wanted him to at least be able to die peacefully. unfortunately, they were threatened that if they didn't go along with this protocol, that they would take Andreas and make him ward of the state, and they would do it anyway. Gordy found out that there had been some parents who actually were incarcerated because they didn't want to go along with these kinds of protocols. So when their child died in the hospital, didn't even have his parents with him. Gordy and Joey didn't want that for Andreas, so they had to be under the radar the last few weeks and months of his life. They couldn't just have, happy closure, have closure with family, do fun things that a child would want to do. They had to be running from the law. And at one point, they actually had to get out of the country just to protect him from being taken. And that's a really wonderful story in the book. I can share that with you if you'd like.
Sure, it's incredibly inhumane.
Exactly.
What we do.
We treat our animals better. Our pets we treat better sometimes.
Right. Sure. Please share that part of the story.
Well, at one point, at the exact moment when they were supposed to be checking into the hospital, Gordy had managed to get a passport for himself and for Andreas, and they were flying out of the country. At that very moment, they looked down and saw the medical institution they were supposed to be checking into at that moment. Gordy took Andreas to China because they had a connection with a medical doctor in China, and this doctor had offered to work with them if he could get Andreas to China. He works mostly with Chinese medicine and herbs and Qigong. So when they got Andreas and Gordy to China, they met with the medical doctor, and he had two friends with him. These friends were very old men. They were Qigong masters. They were from a 6,000-year lineage of Qigong masters. And they had actually worked with many Americans, many people, but Americans in particular, and had healed many cases of so-called incurable diseases. So they gathered around Andreas, and they said some things in Chinese, and all of a sudden they bowed to Andreas and left. Gordy went over to the interpreter and said, well, what did they say? Can they help my son? And the interpreter said, they have identified your son as one of the ancient ones. They say this is his soul's way of leaving the planet. He came for this purpose, and neither your invasive Western medicine nor our Eastern Qigong and Chinese medicine can make this soul stay. He's on his way out. They also advised Gordy that Andreas was the teacher, and you are the student. Pay attention to him. So Gordy and Andreas stayed the full month that they had intended to stay in China, because they still did some of the Chinese medicine just to help him to at least be comfortable in his body.
Right.
But I thought that was so beautiful to know that this is an ancient soul, that we all are so old souls, we come here.
Yes.
Not first time around, and there's a purpose to every life, and I feel that Andreas's purpose, one of his purposes for his 7 years on this planet, was possibly to call attention to the public, perhaps through this book, of the imbalance that our medical institution sometimes has towards people who are dying. They feel desperate to make people live longer than they really are intended to, or than they want to.
Right. Well, I'm a little blown away. Whew. It's totally amazing, and our path and our journey that we take is incredibly brilliant in ours, and no one has a right to say otherwise.
Exactly. I'd love to share where the title of the book came from as well, because people have asked me, why did you call it When the Wind Chimes Chime? And actually, those were the very last words that Andreas uttered as he was leaving the planet. By that time, they were back from China, and they had tried several other natural doctors who were willing to do natural therapies under the radar, of course, because they would lose their license if they did it openly. And nothing had helped. He had gone beyond the point of no return. So at the end of his life, he was in a hospital. And at that point, he reached up and took his oxygen mask off. Gordy, his father, rushed over, of course, to put it back on Andreas's mouth, and Andreas took his daddy's arm and said, "Turn off my lungs." And then he repeated it again, "Turn off my lungs." He lived in a few more moments, I believe, and then his very final words were, "When the wind chimes, chime." Gordy was very close to him and heard him whisper them. Now, I asked Gordy what he thought Andreas meant by that, and Gordy feels that Andreas meant that when you hear wind chimes, know that I'm near you. or something like that. And that may very well be. But I remembered another author. Are you familiar with Daniel Brinkley? Who wrote Saved by the Light. He's another best-selling author. He's written many books, but Saved by the Light, I think, was his first book many years ago, and there's a movie called that based on his near-death experiences. He's had several near-death experiences. The first one, he was clinically dead for 28 minutes. He was actually on a gurney in the hospital. I guess they were ready to take him down to the morgue when someone noticed a little puff of breath on the sheet that was covering his mouth, and they realized he had come back into his body. And so Daniel's books are all about his experience when he was on the other side. And I remembered in Daniel's books that he always said that he heard wind chimes when he crossed over to the other side. So I had a conversation with Daniel on the phone, and he said, yes, when we're leaving this planet, we go through what might be called a tunnel, an energetic tunnel, to reach the other side, and that our energy, our frequency, is acclimating to the frequency on the other side. He said that we hear that as sound, and for him, it always sounded like wind chimes. Some people might hear celestial music. For him, it was wind chimes. And so he said, I believe that Andreas was entering that tunnel at that moment when he said that. And he knew that what was holding him in the body was breath. And that's why he knew intuitively he needed to remove his oxygen mask.
It's brilliant. When I was a young girl, I was 13 when my father passed a week before my 14th birthday, and he passed about 12 times that day. I was raised in a metaphysical religion, and so praying and knowing, talking to the divine was just a way of life for me. And I've seen many, many healings and experienced many of myself. My father, he was lying there, and it's crazy because then I became a hospice nurse 5 or 6 years later. He was lying there, and it was like his left a coat on the bed, just his air was out. And my mom had said, if I'm not around and Daddy passes, remind him that God is his life. And so I remember tapping on his chest saying, Daddy, God is your life. Come back here. God is your life. And all of a sudden, he was choking and breathing and coughing, and he was back. And it was almost like a cartoon to me. One was almost flat, and one was, back up. And by the end of the day, he had said, please let me go. I've come and gone so many times. It's beautiful. I just, I want to be there. And so everybody stopped their begging and their pleading or whatever, or thinking that it was his time to stay here, on this planet when he was ready to move on. It's truly a remarkable experience when you're in the midst of somebody passing. It's beautiful. As a hospice nurse, I've had many patients who have, because I worked in a facility, so I would have 3 a day, not that would pass, but I had 3 patients a day. And when one was about ready to pass, that's when I would go in and be with my patient as they were passing, and I would tend to read spiritual scriptures to them during the passing. It's a beautiful time because a lot of times the family wasn't there or couldn't get there in time. And it's truly remarkable to see how somebody goes and without judgment on our part at all. And as we grow in our spiritual grace, we realize that this is their journey. No one has a right to make any type of comment, just as these medical people had no right to do this to families. And as a parent, I totally understand the frustration of Gordy's position as a father. And it's so beautiful. And then when going to China and finding out that he's such an ancient soul and an old master, that it's it's almost like Andreas knows what to do,
Absolutely, I think he did.
It's really, really beautiful. Let's talk a little bit about dialogue with fear on death and dying even more, and then we'll jump into some other aspects about, because truly, for others, they're the ones that fear the most when someone's passing, because they have abandonment issues or those type of feelings of loss set in. The person passing generally makes generally, if it's a illness, will make peace with it before they go.
Hmm. I think so, and I really remember Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's 5 steps, 5 stages, the denial, the bargaining, the depression, the anger, and then reaching the point of acceptance. And oftentimes I think the patient is the one that reaches acceptance more so, or perhaps sooner, than the family. So many families are afraid to even let the doctor tell the patient, what's going on. They try to shelter them, but if we can really understand that it's a beautiful transition, it can be. If we can really make that closure and really come to terms with it and understand, at least in my belief system, life doesn't end, life goes on. We simply leave the body and continue in another way. And I know that's not everyone's belief system. Some people believe that there just is nothing left of us anymore after we die. And we have to honor everybody's belief system. But I think there's been a lot of damage done to some people by perhaps letting them think that they did something that might send them to eternal damnation or something, and that can bring up a lot of fear. And so that's why in the second part of my book I have journal questions at the end of each chapter, so people can really look at what are the reasons they believe the things they believe. Perhaps their childhood religion taught them certain ways, or their teachers or their parents or whatever. And it could be that some of those belief systems no longer serve us and we're ready to let them go.
That's wonderful. There are so many different emotions attached with death. First the patient and then the family. And truly when we deal with fear and conquering it, one of the things people say is, well, what's the worst that can happen? You die, right? I mean, that seems to be the biggest fear. So if we can conquer that fear, we can certainly conquer every fear in life with the same, I don't want to say organized thought, but with the same clarity and purpose towards it. What, I kind of want to put you on the spot here. What brings you fear?
What brings me here?
Fear.
Fear. Oh, fear. What brings me fear? Well, the act of dying doesn't bring me fear, but I would have to say that the ways of dying could definitely bring me fear. I think that our society is so filled with negative images of death. I mean, you turn on the TV and you're seeing all the local wars, people being blown up. You're seeing movies and TV shows that focus on horrendous ways of dying, and you're seeing the documentaries of people who were held captive and tortured and all of those kind of things. That would bring me fear. I mean, who wouldn't be afraid of that? That's something no one would want to even think about for themselves or for their children or their family.
Right.
So that would be a fear. Other than that, I have a fear of water.
Oh, are you not a swimmer?
No, I never even had my head underwater or my face in water until I was in my 30s, and because I believed in reincarnation.
You probably drowned, yes.
I'm sure, because my mother and sister and cousin all had the same fear. So I think we probably all drowned. I have made myself go whitewater rafting, and I did a jet boat thing a couple
Good for
weeks
you.
ago. Yeah, I prayed a lot during those things.
Right. I had a fear of drowning in water. I'm a water person, and I know my essence takes me back to other times of being a water person. And I remember as a little girl, my biggest fear was my swim lessons, because the teacher at 2 and 3 used to hold me under the water and make me swim to the other side. I was not allowed to come up without swimming to the other side. And so I remember screaming before my swim lessons, and finally my mom paid attention, and she said, "Forget this, don't you hold my baby underwater." And then I was 7, walking around, dancing on my grandparents' pool and on the edge, and thinking and having so much fun outside, pretending I was a mermaid, and I fell in the pool. And inherently I just knew how to swim. It was dog paddle, but I swam to the stairs and got out, and from then on my fear was gone. But I have thought that, because as being a water person, sometimes I love it and embrace it, and then there can be that fear when you're under way too long, and you know that, it's time to come up and you can't. So, and you probably don't understand that because you've never been under that long.
I did put my head under once.
That's interesting. Yeah, it's truly amazing, and I'm also I don't want to say a believer. I understand, and I guess a believer of past lives because I know who I am and my DNA lineage. So it's amazing what we need to heal even in our past that is always in our soul going forward in each moment in time to heal. So the water thing is interesting. I find that very interesting, and the fact that your whole family has that fear. So, and we do travel in units and families, and it's brilliant. Let's see. You have a free gift, and I'm not sure if you want to briefly mention your work experience, only because I think it's fantastic, and it also has to do with your free gift.
Okay. Well, yeah, I decided if someone would like to download one of my 3 CDs, the one in particular deals with death and dying. It's called Forever with God. And on it, I read excerpts from my boss's book, Home with God in a Life That Never Ends. My boss is Neil Donald Walsh. I've worked for him for 12 years, I think, 12 and a half years as his personal assistant. And when one of the things when he first wrote that book, and I knew that someday I was supposed to do something about helping people to die without fear, that phrase, I asked if he would give me permission to read some of the excerpts that touched me from that book onto a CD. And then at the same time, I met a wonderful musician, Stephen Pike. And people can go to his website, P-I-K-E, and Stephen is with a P-H. He's a beautiful musician, and he wrapped the music around my words. So if anyone would like to download that, that will be available on my website, which is donnacorso.com.
That's beautiful.
Yeah.
DONNACORSO.
Perfect. Yes.
And also your credits will be on at the end, and people know how to reach you. I want to talk a little bit more about death, fear, some other experiences that you might be familiar with, where perhaps you had seen a total change in someone, where they actually become the hero of their family because they're able to just calm everybody down. Calm the heck down, everybody.
Well, I've had some people in my family have experiences that calmed them down before they died, particularly my grandmother when she was in her 80s and she was in a nursing home. And my mom went to visit her one morning, and my grandmother said, "Guess who came to visit me today?" And my grandmother was very mentally alert and lucid. And my mom figured it must have been the minister, because who else would come that early in the morning? And my grandmother said, "No, it was Jesus." Because she was a Christian, she interpreted this being of light. She said there was this glowing man at the foot of her bed, and she was wide awake, and he was beckoning her as if to follow him, and then he disappeared. And my grandmother didn't usually say things like that, so I think that really brought her a lot of comfort during her last days or weeks. I don't know how much longer she lived, but I think that really brought her comfort. Right. I have a cousin who's very much alive, but she also has had visions, and she had a vision as a teenager. Actually, she had a vision as a younger child, preteen, where she woke up in the middle of the night and there was a glowing figure standing right next to her bed. And she didn't feel any fear. She interpreted that as Jesus, and she felt that he was telling her, she's going to live her life in a very Christian way. But when she was a teenager, a few years later, it was Christmas Eve, it was night, and she had already gone to bed. She heard her parents talking in the other room, and somehow she knew that her grandmother had just died because she was close to death. And my cousin went over to the window. She felt very drawn to go over to her window, and she looked up in the night sky, and she saw her grandmother walking away from the earth into the sky, and she had a being on each side of her walking with her, whether those were guides or angels or what. But again, my cousin isn't one to say things like that. She's not a woo-woo person. And so I really honor those kind of visions, especially, because that can really help us to understand that life goes on, that there is no such thing as death, that there is simply we leave the body and we go on. And to have a visual like that, I think, is very impactful for that person, and I think for anyone that hears a story like that.
I think that any type of a spiritual type of encounter like that is incredibly impactful.
Mm-hmm.
It's like a moment with God. You know?
Exactly.
Yeah, it's beautiful. When I was probably 14, I think, maybe 15, I used to dream about my father after he passed. My brothers and sisters all had a moment with my dad within 3 days after he passed, where he came to see each of them. In fact, my oldest brother, we couldn't reach him. He was traveling on his motorcycle and decided to come home. And on the third day, I ran out to the driveway and I said, Daddy passed. Where have you been? And he said, I know. He came to me, and so I came home. And my sister had a light come into our room, and they made peace. I'm his natural child, and he adopted them from my mother's previous marriage. And almost every night until I got married at 18, my father visited me. But something that I'd like to share about visitations from the ones we love is, do not be afraid. We have our own choice to go or not to go. My father, I remember being in my room. Then the next thing, I was struggling on the couch to wake up. But in the meantime, my father had come to the door. We lived in this big Mediterranean house that had a gate and then an atrium. My father came to the door, and I opened it, and he said, come on, baby, it's time to go. And I said, okay, Daddy. And I started walking out towards the opening of the gate, and the telephone rang. And I said, oh, my mother was highly abusive to me as a child, and so I was very fearful of her. And I said, oh my God, Daddy, that's Mom. You know that that's Mama, and she's going to have a fit if I leave with you. And he said, don't go in and get the phone, baby. Let's go. And I said, no. And so I struggled, and I woke up on the couch, and I ran to the phone, and it was my mother. And she said, we're obviously have intuition in our family highly. She said, what's wrong? Something's wrong, not right. And I explained to her what happened, and she said, call so-and-so and talk to them and tell them what you experienced. And I did, and this lady had said to me, you have the choice to say no. Next time your dad comes, you tell him that it's not your time. And so he did come back. Months later, he did not come to the front door. He came to the gates, and he was calling me from the gates. And I opened the door and I said, Daddy, I'm not ready to go. It's not my time. And he never asked me to come again. But it was my choice, and it's something not to be fearful of. That's one thing about free will, is we have our choice. And so sometimes these beautiful spiritual things that happen to us, or things that are unexplainable, people become very frightened. I think it was the most beautiful experience of my life. And a couple years ago, I was working with a human, I call her one of my human spiritual guides, a spiritualist, and we were working on my father's passing. She said, it's time to work on it. And I'm like, well, why? I'm fine with it. So in our process, she said, do you know you have a huge angel on your right side? And instantly I felt my father, and I said, is it my father? And she said, no, he's on your left. And so then I spent time, which is so funny because I've spent a lot of time going over your boss's work, Neil's work, and also the journey. And the journey has produced a lot of spiritual healing for me in the last several years. But it was like one of those moments when I knew I had to let him go. And I'm not sure if he's here or not, but we had that deep conversation, and I think even during that journey, listening to it and hearing the words and everything, where I just, I told him, it's time to go, Daddy. You need to do your thing, and I'm fine. I'm perfectly fine. And I know that he knew that. And I knew that his love was because I was his only natural child. I mean, there's a history of, a human history that I have like we all do. But it's beautiful for us to know that we have free will, and we can still always remember, I tell people when they're sad about missing their loved one, that we always have their memory in our heart. And if we keep that happy space, they're always going to be there. Not in the physical form, but isn't that beautiful that we have that ability in the human body to keep memories and things like that?
Absolutely, and it's so important to hold on to those instead of trying to hold the person back from moving on. I remember when I was a kid, one of my classmates had leukemia, and she would come and go. They would give her infusions, and she'd come back to school and be very chubby, and then she'd get skinnier and skinnier, and she'd go away again and get more transfusions. Anyway, eventually she died, and I know that her family were so devastated. But I mean, it's of course we're going to be devastated when we lose a child, but this went on for years and years and years. I don't think they ever got over it. And for me, and this is my belief system, I believe we can actually hold a soul back from moving on if they know that we are really devastated. They might not be able to quite move on as they would. And so it's so important as a person is dying and after they die to let them know that they're safe and that it's fine for them to go and that we will be okay.
I agree with you. I agree with you. And that's really true unconditional love from our part, is to release our beloved. Like
exactly. Some people feel they're giving love by showing how much they want to cling to someone, but that's not the loving thing to do, really.
Right, exactly. It's wonderful. Thank you so much. We're out of time, but this has been a huge treat.
Yeah, for me too. I enjoyed it.
Thank you, Donna. We will all see you in the next segment. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.